Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, a channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of an Infect and help ourselves to our opponent's cards commander deck with Ixhel, Scion of Atraxa as its general. Ixhel, Scion of Atraxa, debuted as the front-facing commander option in the Corrupting Influence pre-constructed EDH deck from Phyrexia All Will Be One. Ixhel is a 2/5 Phyrexian angel with Flying, Vigilance, and Toxic 2 for 1 in Abzan colors. Toxic 2 means that whenever a player is dealt combat damage by Ixhel, they also get 2 poison counters. Toxic is a poison delivery system that is different than Infect. A creature with Infect deals any damage to players in the form of poison counters, and deals any damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. Both Toxic and Infect will be prominent features in the core of this build. Through Ixhel's corrupted mechanic, at the beginning of our end step, each opponent who has at least 3 poison counters exiles the top card of their library face down. We may look at and play these cards for as long as they remain exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast these spells. Our general provides a poison counter-dependent dynamic through which our opponent's exile cards become an extension of our hand. In order to facilitate this card advantage engine, the core of this build will be sculpted to poison our opponents through a vast array of poison delivery systems. Aside from potentially knocking our opponents out of the game with poison counters, this enables Ixhel's corrupted ability to trigger at the beginning of our end step, which provides us with additional lands to play and spells to cast. As the number of poison counters put onto our opponents grow, in addition to the wealth of additional resources granted to us through our opponent's own cards, we will overwhelm and out-resource our opponents on the path to imminent victory. Let's begin the core of this build by constructing a poison counter delivery system for the purposes of sickening our opponents to potential death, while also enabling our general's card advantage corrupted ability. Evasiveness reigns supreme when trying to poison our opponents. Plague Stinger is a 1/1 with Flying and Infect. Pestilent Siphoner is a 1/1 with Flying and Toxic 1. Flensing Raptor is a 1/1 with Flying and Toxic 1, and when it enters the battlefield, another target creature we control with Toxic gets +1/+1 and gains Flying until end of turn. Flesh Eater Imp is a 2/2 with Flying and Infect. We can sacrifice a creature and give it +1/+1 until end of turn. Skitherix the Blight Dragon is a 4/4 with Flying and Infect. We can pay a black mana and give it haste until end of turn, and we can pay 2 black mana to regenerate it. Gliss's Retriever is a 6/6 with haste and Toxic 3 that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Through the Retriever's corrupted ability, when it dies, we exile it, and then we return X target cards from our graveyard to our hand, where X is the number of opponents that have at least 3 poison counters. Tyrannax Rex is a massive 8/8 with Trample, Haste, Toxic 4, Ward 4, and it can't be countered. Skrelv Defector Might is a 1/1 with Toxic 1 that can't block. We can pay a white Phyrexia mana, tap it, choose a color, and another target creature we control gains Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until end of turn. That creature also can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. Speaking of not being able to block, Sidar Kondo of Jamura prevents creatures our opponents control without flying or reach from blocking creatures with power 2 or less. This human knight should allow our poison counter delivering creatures to slip past our opponent's defenses. Behind the Scenes provides another form of potential unblockability by giving creatures we control skulk, meaning that they can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. We also can pay 4 and a white mana and give our creatures a temporary power and toughness boost of +1/+1. We can back our opponents into a very uncomfortable corner with Noxious Assault. It gives creatures we control +2/+2 until end of turn, and whenever a creature blocks this turn, its controller gets a poison counter. Our opponents will be poisoned if they do, and poisoned if they don't. We have ways to create creature tokens that can poison our opponents as well. At instant speed, Carrion Call creates 2 1/1 green Phyrexian insects with Infect. Phyrexian Swarmlord kicks up the creature token production several notches. At the beginning of our upkeep, we create a 1/1 green Phyrexian insect with Infect for each poison counter our opponents have. The Swarmlord's ability could get out of hand very, very quickly. At the beginning of our upkeep, we lose 1 life, and Skrelv's Hive creates a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite with Toxic 1 that can't block. Through this enchantment's corrupted mechanic, if an opponent has at least 3 poison counters, then creatures we control with Toxic have lifelink, which is a sneaky good way to hedge against the life lost from Skrelv's Hive. As a mana sink, we can pay 3 and 1 white Phyrexian mana to activate Might Overseer's ability and create an aforementioned 1/1 Phyrexian Might. As a bonus, as long as it's our turn, creature tokens we control get +1/+0 and have First Strike. First Strike strengthens our creature tokens when attacking. At instant speed, Charge of the Mites provides us the option of creating either 2 1/1 Phyrexian Mites or dealing damage equal to the number of creatures we control to target creature or planeswalker. With White Sun's Twilight, we gain X life and create X 1/1 Phyrexian Mites, and if X is 5 or more, then we destroy all other creatures. Vishgraz the Doomhive has Menace and Toxic 1 for 2 in Abzan colors, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we create 3 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1 that can't block. Vishgraz also gets +1/+1 for each poison counters our opponents have. Vishgraz by itself could prove formidable enough to one-shot an opponent during a game. Let's protect these Phyrexian Mites with Lashiel, Clockwork Scholar. Lashiel prevents all combat damage that will be dealt to attacking artifact creatures we control. Remember, our 1/1 Phyrexian Mites are artifact creature tokens. As a bonus, when 1 or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under our control, we draw a card. This is an ability that triggers only once each turn. Combat is not the only way we can poison our opponents. We can cast various spells that put poison counters onto our opponents directly and also provide us with some peripheral benefits. Infectious Bite has target creature we control deal damage equal to its power to target creature we don't control. If our target creature has Infect, remember, it will deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to the creature targeted by Infectious Bite. Vraska's Fall has each opponent sacrifice a creature or a planeswalker. Phyresis Outbreak gives each creature our opponents control -1/-1 until end of turn for each poison counter its controller has. These 3 cards are versatile ways to rid the battlefield of indestructible creatures. Lastly, we lose 2 life with Infectious Inquiry and draw 2 cards. Once our opponents are poisoned, we can utilize various proliferation abilities and try to knock them out of the game by giving them at least 10 poison counters. Unnatural Restoration does this and returns a permanent card from our graveyard to our hand. Through the basic game-playing fundamental of playing lands, Evolution Sage proliferates whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. Contaminant Grafter is a 5/5 with Trample and Toxic 1, and whenever 1 or more creatures we control deal combat damage to 1 or more players, we proliferate. We can pay 4 and tap Karn's Bastion to proliferate. We can tap Throne of Geth and sacrifice an artifact to do the same. Remember, those 1/1 Phyrexian Mites are artifact creature tokens and can be used as sacrifice fodder for the throne. Although it's not proliferation, Vorinclex Monstrous Raider puts twice the number of poison counters onto our opponents and twice the number of -1/-1 counters onto creatures. Necrogen Rot Priest has Toxic too, and whenever a creature we control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter. This is the equivalent of increasing each creature's toxicity level by 1, which is a welcomed feature for us. Our opponents may not feel as welcomed. We have installed a poison delivery system suitable for giving our opponents poison counters for the peripheral benefit of triggering our general's corrupted ability. Now let's add some redundancy secondary to accessing and utilizing our opponent's cards, just in case Ixhel is languishing in the command zone due to overtaxation. These spells exile opponents' cards from their libraries and allow us to play them for as long as they remain exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. Whenever an opponent attacks us and or a planeswalker we control, Cunning Rhetoric exiles the top card of that player's library. We control our opponents while they're searching their library with Opposition Agent, and they exile each card they find. At the beginning of our end step, Arvinox the Mind Flail exiles the bottom card of each opponent's library face down. We may cast permanent spells from among these exiled cards, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to do so. For some one-and-done exiling effects that follow suit, Predator's Hour gives each creature we control menace until end of turn, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we exile the top card of that player's library face down. With the number of creatures and creature tokens we plan to have on our side of the battlefield, this economical sorcery could yield a trove of opponents' cards. When Gonti, Lord of Luxury, comes into play, we look at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library. We exile one of them face down and put the rest on the bottom of their library in a random order. Dead Man's Chest is an aura that exiles cards from the top of its owner's library equal to the enchanted creature's power when it dies. We may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast spells exiled by these cards. We have ways to cast exile cards other than paying their mana cost. With Chaos Wand, we can pay 4, tap it, and have target opponent exile cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. We may cast that card without paying its mana cost. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, Dauthi Voidwalker exiles it instead with a void counter on it. We can tap Dauthi Voidwalker, sacrifice it, and play a card an opponent owns with a void counter on it without paying its mana cost. Whenever Nashi, Moon Sage's Scion, deals combat damage to an opponent, we exile the top card of each player's library. Until end of turn, we may play one of those cards, and if we cast a spell this way, then we pay life equal to that spell's mana value rather than paying its mana cost. Nashi has a ninjutsu ability that allows us to pay 3 and 1 black mana and return an unblocked attacker we control to our hand. We then put Nashi into play tapped and attacking, and since the Declare blocker step has passed, absent any opponent interaction, then Nasi will deal combat damage and trigger its exile ability. Our opponent's libraries are not the only source of cards from which we can benefit. Whenever Elder Brain attacks a player, we exile all cards from that player's hand, and then that player draws that many cards. When Intellect Devourer enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card from their hand until Intellect Devourer leaves the battlefield. We may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled by these 2 creatures, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. If using our opponent's cards against them isn't enough, then let's include an additional payoff that enhances this exile dynamic even further. At the beginning of our end step, Brainstealer Dragon exiles the top card of each opponent's library. We may play these cards for as long as they remain exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. Whenever a non-land permanent an opponent owns enters the battlefield under our control, they lose life equal to its mana value. When paired with Ixhel or any of the other exile abilities showcased in this video, Brainstealer Dragon provides an alternate win condition that our opponents may not see coming. Now let's close out this video with a sampling of cards that synergize with and enhance our themes. With triggered abilities coming into focus, secondary to optimizing our general's corrupted mechanic, let's include a couple of other outlets for replicating these exile effects. We can pay 2 and tap Strionic Resonator and copy target triggered ability we control. Lithoform Engine does the same, but also can copy activated abilities and instant sorcery and permanent spells we control. If our opponents do not succumb to poison, then perhaps they will fold under the pressure of losing to their own cards. Generally, during building around series videos like this one, we leave the land base up to each individual deck brewer. However, we would be remiss if we did not stress the importance of producing as much mana as possible for the purposes of casting as many of our opponent's spells each turn as possible. With that in mind, adding Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Cabal Coffers become nearly auto-includes. If we can use our mana as mana of any color to cast the majority of our opponent's exiled cards, then fixing our mana is not as important as producing oodles of it, which each of these two lands can do. Urborg makes every land a swamp in addition to its other types, and we can pay 2 and tap the coffers to add a black mana for each swamp we control. Even Cabal Stronghold is in play here. It costs 1 more mana to activate, but it still has the potential to add an abundance of mana to our mana pool. Although it's not an option for everyone, Gaia's Cradle fits the description of a land that can generate a lot of mana. If adding this land to the build is not feasible, then perhaps adding Growing Rites of Itlimoc is. When this enchantment enters the battlefield, we look at the top 4 cards of our library. We may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into our hand. We put the rest of these cards on the bottom of our library in any order. At the beginning of our end step, if we control 4 or more creatures, a very realistic feat in this build, then we transform Growing Rites of Itlimoc into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, which is a functionally better version of Gaia's Cradle. It taps to add a green mana, or it taps to add a Gaia's Cradle-like 1 green mana for each creature we control. Either way, each of these lands can produce an abundance of mana for the purposes of casting and using our opponent's cards against them. Ancient Tomb is a consideration, as well as Temple of the False God. Remember, even though each of these lands produce colorless mana, this colorless mana can be used as mana of any color when casting the majority of our opponent's exiled cards. Other considerations for enhancing our mana base include Mirari's Wake and Zendikar Resurgent, which add 1 additional mana of any type of land produced whenever it is tapped for mana. Mirari's Wake also gives creatures we control +1/+1, while Zendikar Resurgent draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell. Lastly, whenever we tap a permanent for mana, Mana Reflection produces twice as much mana instead. Note, this ability applies to any permanent we tap for mana, not just lands. Both Soul Ring and Mana Crypt each tap for 4 colorless mana. Basalt Monolith taps for 6 mana, and, well, of course, can produce infinite mana with Mana Reflection on our side of the battlefield. Hopefully our opponents will have infinite patience. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of an Infect and help ourselves to our opponent's cards commander deck around Ixhel, Scion of Atraxa as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting the core of an Infect and help ourselves to our opponent's cards EDH deck, in addition to providing ways to optimize these themes. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.